artifacts and how it helps our current understanding in these events. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Caron. Thank you.
Okay, this is a great group. We've got a small enough group that I think, if you have questions, don't hesitate. This actually works really well for me because people often, they have specific questions that they... Oh, I think I do. So feel free to jump in. We're going to talk about harmful algal blooms. So how many of you are aware to some degree of harmful algal blooms? You've heard of red tides, I guess. Red tides, unfortunately, are one of those terms that mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Really, red tide is just a discoloration of the water itself and doesn't necessarily mean it is a toxic situation, but it's often interpreted that way. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But just to give you a little heads up here, there's going to be a quiz right at the beginning here. So do we have any doctors in the audience? No doctors? Good, because I would have excluded you. The rest of you, here's a medical case for you. So this was the Jacobi Medical Center in the Bronx. Okay, the Bronx is not a clue. Patient was 28. He said he was healthy until 3 days ago. He and his girlfriend went to the Bahamas to celebrate his birthday. That is one good girlfriend. After a long day of swimming and snorkeling, they decided to try a restaurant they had heard good things about. They both ordered seafood. She ate the red snapper. He had the barracuda. And then they went out dancing. Out on the dance floor, he doubled over, caught off guard by an intense pain that knifed through his gut and took his breath away. Then abdominal cramps, diarrhea, vomiting, fever, da-da-da-da-da. So, food poisoning, right? Yeah. You guys read the title. Okay. He slept for 2 days. Okay. When he finally felt that he could venture out, he got dressed. He noticed his hands seemed clumsy. His feet felt as if they were asleep, as if he were walking on a carpet of tiny nails. His girlfriend bought him a smoothie from a juice stand. The fruit drink smelled delicious. He took a sip and immediately spit it out. Ooh. Somebody's good. The icy cold drink felt as if it had come straight off the stove, as if it were boiling hot. Okay, he took another sip. His mouth burned. It felt too hot to swallow. And very good analysis there. There is a doctor in the crowd. Really? Okay. That wasn't you, was it? Strawberry. Okay. Yep. So Ciguatera. How many have heard of Ciguatera? Not too commonly known up here, but people do know about it. It is actually caused by a small organism. This little organism right here that has an electron micrograph. Looks like a little flying saucer sort of shape. It actually is microscopic in size, and the cells will attach to algae that grow on the bottom, kind of little fuzz, peach fuzz that you see on surfaces in tropical to subtropical environments. When you get enough of these little cells that produce this toxin, a little herbivorous fish will come along, will eat that. The toxin will get accumulated in that fish. Another fish comes along and eats that fish. And then finally you have something like this, like a snapper or a big barracuda here, which is what our patient had. And if it has been feeding on a fish or fishes that have been concentrating Ciguatera, you end up with a slug of it in your system, and you end up with this neurotoxic effect. And it is indicative of the kind of issues that we face with these harmful algae. Now, this particular one, I can tell you, was delicious. We ate that one years ago. But I wouldn't recommend eating large predatory fish when you go to a tropical, subtropical environment unless you really know what's going on. And unfortunately, I guess for people who have suffered from it, the ability to detect this is getting better, but it's still not that great. Well, what makes harmful algal blooms harmful? Obviously, the production of toxins. And there are a number of these types of algae that exist in various places, and we have some of them here off our coast, that can produce various types of toxic materials, toxic compounds. And that's certainly one of the things that makes harmful algae harmful. But you don't have to produce a powerful neurotoxin in order to be considered harmful. There are species of algae, microalgae, that will cause gill irritation and clogging in fish, or feather wetting, actually, in birds. So just last year and the year before, there was an incident in Monterey Bay where a number of birds, a number of seabirds died on the coast, and it was eventually tracked back to an alga that produced a material that acted like a surfactant. It had basically acted like soap, and it wet the birds' feathers when they got into this. Because it wet their feathers, they were in direct contact with the water, there was heat exchange, they were hypothermic, and they died basically of exposure. So harmful, but certainly not toxic per se. There are other organisms that build up to such concentrations that all the oxygen in the water can be used, either directly by the algae during the night, when they respire like everything else. They don't photosynthesize and produce oxygen at night, they use it. Or when those algae die and they're decomposed, and the bacteria use the oxygen in the water. And hypoxias can cause a big problem. I have a graduate student who is just now finishing a couple of chapters on the fish kill that happened in King Harbor in the city of Redondo Beach. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. It's been in the news, or it was in the news. It happened in March of this year, and they had 170 tons of Pacific sardine that died in a very small confine, caused a tremendous hypoxic event, and that had a great impact. That was actually not linked to a harmful algal bloom, but they often are. In King Harbor in 2005, same situation, and that one we do think was linked actually to the buildup of biomass in the water, an algal bloom that took place. It wasn't a toxic bloom, but it was enough that it used all the oxygen in the water at night and killed the fish. Reduced light penetration. Yep. Yeah, actually, we do. The oxygen in the water was, little side note, the oxygen in the water was fairly low at the time that the event happened. Prior to the event, there wasn't an algal bloom. I mean, that's literally what we were studying. We found out about the fish kill in 2005 after the fact, and we had sensors in the water since 2006. 5 years we waited for the next bloom or the next event. We finally got a fish kill, and we showed that it wasn't an algal bloom that caused it. What happened, for whatever reason, a huge number of fish boxed themselves into one isolated basin in King Harbor. That's the northern basin, if you know the marinas there. And they literally stayed there until they used up all the oxygen. Now, the water, as I say, was kind of pre-charged with low oxygen to begin with, and we believe that is a consequence of deep upwelled waters that came from offshore during a storm that happened 2 days or a day before the fish kill. We do have deep anoxic waters or hypoxic waters offshore, and with the right meteorological conditions, those can be drawn up into the surface. So we think the fish got boxed up in there, low oxygen water came in, and they ended up using the rest of the oxygen themselves. Sure. Also, food web. Is there another question? Okay, sorry. Another thing that can happen is food web disruption. There are organisms that simply don't taste that good. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. You know, if you're truly in the food chain, the one thing you can do to keep your life going longer is to taste like crap, because nobody wants to touch you. Nobody wants to eat you. So literally, there are algae that have used noxious materials as a defense, presumably to keep grazers from grazing them down. Okay. Whoops, I'm sorry, wrong button. So we do get these massive red tides. We have discolorations of the water. This is a really famous one. If you go on Google red tide, West Coast, you're liable to get this picture. It's by a guy, Peter Franks, down at Scripps, who took this years ago. This is a small boat he's pulling. I don't know if you can see, but it's a line of buoys behind him or them. And you can see this huge accumulation. This is the organism. It's a little less than a millimeter in size. It's an organism called Noctiluca scintillans. The scintillans gives you a hint of what's neat about that organism. It's highly bioluminescent. So, you know, at night, this was, I'm sure, an incredibly beautiful bloom. This particular organism, it reaches high abundance. It certainly discolors the water. It presents what we typically think of as a quote-unquote red tide, but not toxic. The only problem you could get with this would be the buildup of enough biomass that it could use the oxygen in the water. Okay, so are these unusual events? This is almost always a question that comes up. We've been studying these things for a while now in our local region. But before people really started looking for harmful algae or red tides, you can go back in the literature. This one is from 1902, so over 100 years ago, people were characterizing what they called an unusual occurrence of dinoflagellates off the California coast. Red tides that occurred, presumably at that point, totally by natural occurrence. I mean, this isn't something where humans probably had a huge influence on the coastal environment. Not sure you can still say that, but in fact, at least here, we do have evidence that they were taking place. The person here, this was down in off of San Pedro, California, right in my neck of the woods. You'll see San Pedro again because I'm going to show you a figure of some of the more recent work that we're doing in that area. Well, is this unusual? Well, there are a lot of organisms in seawater. For those of you who might not know, when you go surfing or swimming or whatever, what you take in, if you swallow a teaspoon of water, gird your loins, because here it comes. 100 million viruses, 10 million bacteria, something on the order of thousands of algae and protozoa. There are a lot of microorganisms in seawater. Most of them are harmless, even beneficial. I mean, remember, microalgae are the base of the food chain. If they weren't there, we wouldn't have much else for a food chain. So they are, for the most part, good. Even the bacteria decompose things that are dead in the ocean. If they were not there, you'd have the buildup of dead organic material. And the viruses, most of those attack the bacteria. So there is a lot that's in there, but it is not necessarily bad. However, every now and then there are organisms that are highly toxic. They do produce substances that are nasty. And when that happens, and when these materials get into food webs, then we have threats to human health. Not only to human health, of course, but human health we can do something about. We often have issues around here that have to do with animal health, marine animal health. And of course, we can't take them out of the food chain. But through warnings, through the great work of the California Department of Public Health, we can take humans out of that loop if, in fact, we're aware that these things are present in the water and in the shellfish that we might be eating. Well, if we look at the ones in our area now. Now, this is a picture of the United States. Obviously, you can see these various color codes. And down here, it gives you a key to all these different types. These PSP, ASP, these are paralytic shellfish poisoning, amnesic shellfish poisoning, neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. The shellfish poisoning part, of course, comes because shellfish are one of those things that are really good at concentrating little tiny particles that are in the water in their stomachs. So if there are toxic algae in the water, they filter those organisms out and they pack them into their stomachs. If you eat one of those shellfish, you have the equivalent of lots and lots and lots of algae because they're packed into the stomach. So a lot of these things do actually have this SP following them. This CFP is ciguatera fish poisoning, so that's slightly different. Now, if you look in our area, we have a couple of nasty ones here. We have something called paralytic shellfish poisoning and amnesic shellfish poisoning. And I will talk about those. And just to give you a little bit of a feel, why we're so concerned about these two. This is information. This is obviously now a world picture. And this is information. These little red dots show where we knew paralytic shellfish poisoning was present in the ecosystem in 1970. You can see a number of stations up here, a couple of dots over here, and a couple over here on the western side of the Pacific. And this is what we know of as of 5 years ago. And we could probably put a few more dots on there in the last few years. But you'll notice that there's prevalence in a lot of places now around the world of paralytic shellfish poisoning. So the question is, of course, is this increased occurrence or is it simply increased awareness? Chances are there's some of both. Okay? And the way I like to liken this is think of increased awareness if you've heard of something called Lyme disease. Okay? Lyme disease is a little bacterial spirochete. It's carried by a tick, so if you get bitten by a deer tick, you have to worry about Lyme disease. In 1980, somebody figured out what that came from, what that disease was caused by. Happened in Lyme, Connecticut, which is why it's called Lyme disease, if you ever wondered. And as soon as they recognized the symptoms, they went, oh, there it is in Montana. Oh, there it is in Texas. Oh, there it is in California. All over the country immediately. Increased awareness. They simply started looking for it because they knew what to look for. That's undoubtedly where some of these dots come from. Okay? However, if you think about West Nile virus, we know almost to the day and time when the person got off the plane who carried West Nile into JFK. And then it got into the population of birds and went whoosh across the United States. Truly an emerging situation. It came in, it wasn't there before, and we watched it march across the U.S. Okay? And it's here now, of course, killing bird populations. Both of these things, both increased frequency and increased awareness, probably contribute to what we know now about harmful algal blooms. So I don't want you to think that this is something that all of a sudden has appeared out of nowhere, and I'll give you another for instance of that in a few minutes. But certainly we do worry about the increased frequency, increased severity of these events, and that's why we're studying these things. Now, before we get into the real nasty ones down here, I'm just going to show you a few of these. I did show you this massive bloom of Noctiluca. That was the first red tide picture. Yep. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And don't be afraid if you've got questions. You know, I love questions, so don't be afraid to jump in. We'll just go at whatever pace we go. So, but what I did want to do is to just kind of bring you through some of the innocuous stuff, through some of the more noxious stuff, and then we'll get into talking about a few of these real toxic ones pretty quickly. But just to give you, again, a feel for how you can actually have color without necessarily death and destruction. This is the Scripps Pier. This is La Jolla in here. So right now, actually, there is another bloom. This is not this year. This was taken a few years ago. I can't remember exactly what year. But this is actually going on right now off of San Diego. It has actually moved up. We've now seen this bloom, this discoloration of the coastline is now up as far as Newport Beach. It's just now getting into Santa Monica Bay. We've seen it just recently. It's the classic time of year. Late summer into the fall is when we see this particular organism. Has the great name of Lingulodinium polyedrum. And this is the organism. It's about 40 micrometers across or long. And it has this characteristic roundish shape. And it's got this little kind of a groove around the side of it. It's a dinoflagellate. If you know anything about algae, you don't have to get hung up on that. But basically, this organism can reach huge abundances. Not exactly sure why these things come, but they come about every 5 years or so. So in 2005, we had a massive bloom of this. And in fact, during that year, one of my graduate students, before we really knew what it was brave enough to wade out into the water and scoop up a bucket. And this is a bucket. You're looking down into this bucket, and that's unconcentrated seawater. This is 20 liters of water in a clear container. Tough to tell that it's clear, but it's a transparent container. And again, you can see the density of algae in that water at that time. Now, this organism actually does produce something that is called yesotoxin, and it is toxic if you inject it into the muscles of mice. The mice do have difficulty with it, but it is not at all clear that it causes trouble if you take it in by ingestion. And the organism that we have that blooms here on our coast produces very, very, very small amounts of this, luckily. In other parts of the world, this same species produces lots of yesotoxin, and they do worry about it, and they do monitor for it. And we are obviously watching this organism. But for whatever reason, the environmental conditions that we have on our coast grow this thing, but don't seem to let it allow it to produce much toxin, which is a good thing for us. But of course, we worry that environmental conditions might change, and this thing that is, gets up to gigantic abundances may at some point become a consideration. Yes? Yeah, I have not seen any information to suggest that water temperature makes it more toxic. But this particular organism likes warm water in order to grow well. So that's why we see it in late summer, in early fall, when our waters here on the California coast tend to be their warmest in coastal waters. Yep. No, most of the algae, when they reach bloom abundances, they exclude other things. And it's not exactly clear why. I mean, some of them clearly are producing substances that deter things from coming near them. I mentioned that, that's a great defense. If you're in the food chain, produce something that other things don't like. But we've never seen other organisms that are actually attracted in and will use these as a food source, at least not in these kinds of densities. And there are still a lot of the ecology to be determined. So if you do have a bloom like this one in your coastal waters, and you happen to have a desalination plant, for example, that's pulling water from those coastal waters, it's a problem, even if it's non-toxic. We've actually worked a great deal with the West Basin Municipal Water District down in El Segundo, down kind of near LAX. And we've actually looked at what happens when these harmful algae get loaded onto reverse osmosis desalination facilities. Because, we're going to be doing desal in a big way in the future. There's no way we can meet the water demands of this region simply by expecting the Sierras are always going to provide that water. And we've seen this in the last several years. We got a reprieve this year with a good snowpack from last winter, but we'll be back in that situation. The difficulty is if you have your pipe located in the wrong spot, probably at the wrong depth, you end up with this. And you don't need to worry about what you're seeing here other than the fact that this is essentially, here, is the amount of pressure that you've got to use to push the water against that RO membrane because it literally is clogging. And what you're seeing is that the pressure is basically going up as you try and filter water. You're requiring more and more energy, which is costly, to try and push the seawater through the RO membrane, get rid of the salts and the organisms that are in there. And what we found here is that this increase in what's called this transmembrane pressure is directly related to the number of this ligulidinium that were in the water at that time. So there are real considerations. This is an economic, a financial consideration. If you're going to make desal water, you'd better know where that pipe is going to be relative to one of these blooms. And maybe you want to have an alternative, maybe a couple of pipes coming in, one that's deeper that you might want to use if you've got a bloom going on at the surface. So we've been working with places like West Basin to look at what happens when you've got a desal facility with respect to loading of the filters, as you can see here, and also what happens when you put some of these neurotoxins onto the RO membrane as well. And I'll tell you that the bottom line there is good news so far. The RO seems to be very effective at removing toxins. Okay, other things that come under the category of kind of gross, but there's no real big deal. In Southern California, last 3 years now, we have been running into what we call green scums. And you can see the water here at Santa Monica Pier, this big swath of green scum. And then this is somewhere off of Orange County. You can see another swath of this right at the surface. Kind of ugly, kind of gross, not the sort of thing you want to swim in. Some people get, nice phone calls telling them they're the winner of a lottery. I get phone calls that say, Dave, we've got scum, and it's like, okay, thanks. We'll take a sample. When we've looked at these events, it actually is a very little tiny alga. It's these micrographs of it. This thing is just a little bit bigger than your basic bacterium. It's maybe 2 to 3 to 4 micrometers in size. We know what it is. It's a little green alga. It actually is a really good food item in the food web. There's nothing wrong with this thing. And you can see, though, it's accumulating to high abundance. They actually use this in aquaculture facilities to feed some of the things that they grow in aquaculture facilities. So it's edible. And what we believe is going on is this thing kind of knows, in an ecological evolutionary sense, it knows that it's good food. And it's right at the top of the water column. It's right at the surface because there's so much UV up there that other organisms can't get up there and try to exploit that biomass. And it turns out that this organism looks like it has very good UV protection. So it's kind of protected. It's not getting blasted by the ultraviolet up there. But predators that might want to come up and feed on it are probably deterred from coming right up into that surface water. So you end up with these scums. Another organism that we see around here, now we're into the category of things that truly are what we would call noxious. These are organisms that gum up the food web. Okay, instead of allowing themselves to be eaten and that energy passed up, they put a brake on, or put brakes on the whole system. I don't know if you can see this, there's a large colony of little tiny, tiny green dots here. This is a different type of microscopy for viewing them. The little light green dots are the cells themselves. And you can see they're in these little kind of circular to oval colonies. This is a big one. These can get up to the size that you can actually see with your naked eye. You can't see the actual individual cells, but you can see the colonies. And these colonies, this is an organism called Phaeocystus. It's very well known in other parts of the world, in the North Sea, in the Antarctic. This forms massive blooms. And these colonies are, if you can think of a balloon of mucus. So the inside is liquid-filled, but the balloon itself, it's lovely, isn't it? Balloon. I told you, the phone calls for scum are actually nice rather than balloons of mucus. They don't make very good birthday balloons. But if you think of a balloon with cells embedded right in the skin of the balloon, that's essentially what you're looking at. Now this is this colony is a normal part of its life cycle, but at some point it jettisons the colony, the mucus material, the cells swim off, and you're left with this mucousy material, which floats to the surface, and if the wind is right and the conditions are right, it whips up into this meringue-like material that you see there. This is off the beach at Santa Barbara 3 or 4 years ago, I believe. And you can see there's quite a bit of accumulation. This is just to give you an instance of how I get this information. These two pictures were sent to me. I got an email and then a phone call from the person who's the director of the Santa Monica Pier Aquarium. And she said, Dave, we've got somebody who saw some stuff on the beach. Could you take a look at these pictures? And so these pictures got sent through her to me. And I looked and I said, oh yeah, I think I know what this is. Get a water sample, we'll confirm. And sure enough, we found this thing in the water, this species. I get an email directly from the person who took the pictures a few days later saying, so what was that stuff? And I wrote back and I said, well, it's this alga. And he wrote back and said, well, those are my kids playing in it. Is that toxic? And I thought, well, that's a great time to ask me. But luckily, no, it's not. But it is really smelly. So this stuff it has that kind of fishy smell to it. And when you get blooms of this stuff, it's pretty gross. We've worked in the Antarctic where there are massive blooms of this. And the ships, which use reverse osmosis for their drinking and their normal water use, fresh water on the ships, it goes right through the filters. There is so much material that gets loaded. You take a shower, and it's like taking a shower in fish water. It's nasty. But it's about the only thing that's nasty about the Antarctic.
So what happens to all the chlorine stuff?
It eventually gets, it gets, of course, in some cases, it takes a little while. Okay. So if you Google sea foam in Australia, you'll come up with these pictures. And, you can see this kid, I guess he's saying, Mom, I lost my surfboard. But you can see people sitting in here. And this is, that's quite a few feet of it. Now, prior to these pictures, which are, 3 years ago, I have seen pictures in the North Sea where they're very familiar with this organism. And in fact, fishermen, as fishermen do everywhere, they know more about the ocean than anybody else. And they call this stuff, this organism, Dutchman's backy juice, which I'm sure is not a very complimentary thing to Dutchmen, but it indicates that when they pull their nets and they've got muck on their nets, this stuff, they're not going to catch fish because the fish avoid it. It completely shuts down the food web. Now this is, they didn't know what this was when they put these pictures out, but I'm positive that's what we're looking at. But obviously there's a massive bloom going on offshore somewhere, and this material has been blown in. Yes.
So all these things kind of happen in probably southern Australia in colder waters. So I just thought, man, honestly,
Right. The species there are different species, and different species exist in different places. So the species in the North Sea is different than the one that we see in Antarctica, and is different than the one we've seen out here. But they are like cool water. Yeah, the ones certainly in the Antarctic will grow in cold water, but most algae will grow in very, very cold water. The Ross Sea, Antarctica, where we've worked many times, in the dead of summer, it gets up to a balmy 0.5 degree C. And there are tons of algae. There are tons of algae growing in the water. But that particular organism there, for some reason, does extremely well. Yeah. Probably what you were looking at. Yeah. Yep. It does. It kind of has that kind of fishy smell to it. Yep. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, you don't see adults there. You know, these are kids, you know, so. Okay, so those, just to give you a feel, you know, those were sort of some innocuous things. Still color. You can still see color in the water, and, you know, it's not necessarily horrible. Then some that are, you know, maybe scums. This is the green scum organism, or that was the foam organism. But then in our area, we do have a few that are worrisome. One that we haven't done much with yet on our coast is this particular organism. These are micrographs of different species of the same group. These are organisms. Again, if you know algae, this is a dinoflagellate, and the genus is called Dinophysis. These organisms produce a substance called okadaic acid, which, if you get it in your seafood, you end up with diuretic shellfish poisoning. Okay, they usually, again, concentrated through shellfish, and you kind of know what the symptoms are, and you spend a very unhappy night. It doesn't usually, in fact, I don't know of any documented deaths from this, but boy, you want to die. You know, you feel like you want to die. Yes, so the worry about this, we do have this on our coast. It has not yet, to our knowledge, caused substantial illness, but the substance itself, okadaic acid, is a tumor promoter. It's used in hospitals or in research, biomedical research, as a tumor promoter to follow and understand tumor growth. So it is a concern, and we have begun work to try to document where this organism is and what its abundances are. So this is something we're watching, and should it, you know, raise its ugly head, there will certainly be warnings that will come out for that one. Now, if we go back to the slide for a second, these two that have the little asterisks down here, these are the ones that we do worry about. And in fact, the California Department of Public Health does an extremely good job of monitoring seafood from our area in the waters to find out, to know when blooms of these organisms occur and the toxins that they produce are present. So if we go to the first one here, this is an electron micrograph here, a couple of cells here. This is a related organism. These are actually, there are a few groups of organisms that produce this toxin, or a group of toxins called saxitoxins. But this organism here, which is called Alexandrium, is the biggest culprit in our area. It is monitored by California Department of Public Health. Saxitoxins are measured, and they will shut down the coast if for any sort of taking of seafood, or at least of shellfish, if in fact this is observed in the water. This is a very powerful, in fact it is one of the most powerful biologically produced substances, pound for pound, or microgram for microgram. I shudder to think of a pound of this stuff. But this toxin acts by blocking nerve impulses. So in essence, it shuts down your nerve function. It affects, for those physiologists in the crowd, it affects sodium channels, and it disrupts their function. And what that means is your autonomic nervous system, among other nervous systems, shuts down. So you stop breathing, and your heart stops beating. You can get pass this material through, so if you get treatment, and they can keep you breathing and keep your heart beating, they can actually flush it from your system. But it is a very powerful toxin, and it acts relatively quickly. So this is one that we do worry about. You know, in terms of how they treat it clinically, I'm not sure. I'm sure they give you a buttload of epinephrine, you know, to just keep you cranking. But I don't know if they pass fluids or exactly what they might do, to tell you the honest truth. Yep. If you go to the fish market, you can be very confident that you're getting good stuff because, as I say, they monitor for these things very, very well. What you have to be careful of is if you're a recreational shellfisher, you need to pay attention. You know, and if you go to the beach and it says this beach, if you see one of those red signs that I showed you, you know, up at the beginning of the talk, you see one of those signs that says, you know, the shellfishing closed, do not take, don't do it. You know, there's a really good reason why they're putting those signs up. It's not simply so you'll leave the shellfish alone and they'll grow. It's because they are toxic. Yes? Early 1900s, and it was earlier than that on the East Coast. So it's been in effect a long time. How they have monitored for it, and of course that increases. I mean, that's part of the research that I do. We literally have a paper that's in press that uses genetic techniques to identify this organism at very, very low concentrations in the water. In fact, concentrations, abundances that are much lower than any significant toxin buildup in the system. And those genetic techniques are incredibly sensitive. So the techniques are getting better, but they have always had, well, not always, for the last 100 years or so, they've had mechanisms in place to monitor for these things. Yes? Yes, actually, there are. In fact, there's like a double negative in there. Only don't take shellfish in months that don't end with an R or something. I don't know. Yeah, that's old saying. But yes, the reason is that once you get into the later months of the fall, typically these are summer organisms. But that saying is much more effective on the East Coast, in New England area, and in the Northwest, where the temperatures get cooler quicker. Because down here, fall temperatures are fairly warm. So you have to be aware of it. And I think I have a figure that shows you sort of the average month, or monthly averages coming up. So I'll show you that. Yes? Yes. In fact, they do depurate it. So if you let them just do their thing, it does not seem to affect anything, any function in the shellfish, and they'll eventually pass it like they'll pass anything else. But you got to give them time to do that. Yeah. And that's true of this organism as well. And this is probably our biggest worry right now. And I'm sure that the California Department of Public Health would say, no, we're worrying about both of them, because they are. But this is an organism that we have seen increased frequency and increased severity of blooms in recent years. And this is actually there are a number of algae here. This is an electron micrograph just to show you one of these cells. This is a group of organisms called diatoms, and they literally produce a little glass house that they live within. And what you're seeing here are a number of these little glass houses linked up end to end. They're kind of overlapping just a little bit, and they form a long, thin chain in the water. Now, these are only a few micrometers wide, but they're about up to 1/10 of a millimeter long. So you can't quite see them, but actually when they link up end to end, if you see these, if you have a little vial of these in water and you hold it up to the light, it looks like you have a bunch of little hairs in the water. So you can actually see these with your naked eye to some degree. These organisms, this group has a wonderful name called Pseudonychia. Really not an easy name to pronounce. And they produce something called domoic acid, which is usually misprinted in the press as demonic acid, which probably is not too far from the truth. Symptoms in humans, this causes amnesic shellfish poisoning in humans if you get it through shellfish poisoning. Causes nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps, headache, dizziness, blah, 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 blah. And it can cause loss of short-term memory, and it can and has caused death, but rarely. And I think the rarely is because they have done such a good job in recent years of monitoring for this worldwide, certainly on the U.S. coasts. In Southern California, because we monitor for it so well, and in fact in the country in general, in our neck of the woods, it's marine mammals and seabirds that take it on the chin. They're the ones that can't get out of the way because they can't remove themselves from the food web. And this does get into these toxins, or these algal toxins, that can affect populations of sea animals. So, again, big question, well, is it just shown up recently? I haven't heard about it until the last 10 years. Well, the first incidents where they linked mammal deaths or marine animal deaths to domoic acid and this Pseudonychia organism was in the late 1980s, early 1990s in Monterey Bay. Okay. When I moved to Southern California in 1999, they said, oh, we don't have those problems here. I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. You have dead animals. You sure about that? No. The animals get sick up in Monterey. They swim down. They die on our beaches. I said, okay, I'm all right with that. If you look in the literature, though, you actually find that the organisms that produce this toxin are present. They've been present on this coast for quite a while, if you look at in the scientific publications. There are also things that seem unexplained but seem real familiar. And I just pulled this here. I put this up. This is from the Santa Cruz Sentinel in 2006. They did, one of their 150 years of the Sentinel. I didn't know they were alive that long. And they published a paper where they picked out a few of their choice things that they had done over the years. And one was this story from August 18th, 1961. And they went on to describe this massive flight of sooty shearwaters, seabirds, fresh from a feast of anchovies, collided with shoreside structures from Pleasure Point to Rio del Mar during the night. Okay, and they came in, and these birds were completely out of their minds. They littered the streets and the roads. They brought down. Oh, remember television antennas? Who remembers television antennas? Yeah, they actually had them. They did crazy stuff. They were smashing into doors, and almost certainly, 1961, 30 years before they had documented domoic acid poisoning of animals on the West Coast, almost certainly this is a domoic acid poisoning event. Okay. Now, this was interesting for me from a scientific point of view. In fact, I pulled this slide up, or this part of this, up at it was a lecture that I gave to a group of science librarians. Let me tell you, you got to know your stuff when you talk to science librarians. In the middle of this talk, this was right at, we had a lunch and then I gave this talk. One of them jumped up out of the room and ran out. And I thought, ooh, bad clams? No, that's too bad. Came rushing back in 15 minutes later, holding a piece of paper and said, I've got it. And everybody kind of went, you've got what? I've got the original article. They had gone and gotten the original article. He wasn't the only one. Somebody else got that original article, and probably some of you know who that was. In 1961, Alfred Hitchcock requested a copy of that Sentinel, and it's believed that that story is what gave rise to the inspiration for his movie The Birds. So, domoic acid fame. There you are. Okay, so this gets at, when somebody asked, when are these things around, when do I need to worry about this? What you're looking at here, this is a lot of information now compiled by the California Department of Public Health. And we went through and summarized. This is a yearly cycle here going from January to December. And this figure shows you the occurrence of domoic acid. And these are kind of the means, the averages, monthly averages, and this is the maximum value that we saw in any of those months. And then this is for paralytic shellfish poisoning. This is the saxitoxins. And here you can see, again, there's a break here, just so you're sure. So months in the winter, the true winter for us, are low months, but then the numbers jump up anytime from kind of spring through the summer and into the fall. So these organisms can be around almost any season, although in the case of domoic acid, certainly in our area there seems to be a preference for springtime blooms. And that actually is consistent with the ecology of diatoms, the group of organisms that in which Pseudonychia sits. They tend to be springtime bloom formers. And it also fits in the sense that dinoflagellates tend to like warmer waters. That's when they tend to do better. So, your months with an R typically are safe, especially if you're in the northwest or the northeast. Not so much down here. Okay, so 1999, I told you I came here. In 2003, there was what a quote-unquote unusual mortality event. Marine mammals are dying, birds are falling out of the sky, and it's what the heck is going on? And the story that I got, no. Those animals get sick up north. They have a domoic acid problem. They come down south and they die on our beaches. And I said, well, I'm not sure. So we went out in 2003. We actually looked and we found significant amounts of domoic acid present in the plankton and the species that produce it. We have since looked at this particular area. This is San Pedro now. This is the LA Long Beach Harbor area, if you know that. Palos Verdes Peninsula right out here. LA is up in here. For some of you, that's the Great Satan. I know, I'm sorry, but LA is large. In any event, right in the area near the harbor, these lines here are the harbor breakwater, and these hot colors represent high concentrations of domoic acid. I wouldn't worry too much about the numbers, but suffice it to say, here in 2006, these numbers right there were the highest values that anyone had documented in the plankton anywhere. So clearly, there was a local issue going on. We also have been able to document how and where and how these, why these blooms get going. And I don't want to go into the oceanography too much here, but in essence, we have autonomous vehicles that will fly through the water. They go up and down, and they'll fly in a pre-programmed pattern, and they'll come back, and they collect information the entire time they're flying through the water. And what you can then do is you can construct kind of a two-dimensional slice through the water. And what this figure is showing you here, the hot colors, are showing you that down at about 20 meters, this hot red is a huge phytoplankton bloom that's going on. Now, if you were looking up in surface waters, these light colors and the blue colors indicate low concentrations or low abundances of algae. And it shows you that you might not see much, if anything, up at the surface. But if you get down here to 20 meters where the algae are really cooking, there's a real bloom going on there. And so we have a pretty good idea of where these blooms are forming in the water column. And they're getting delivered to the shore, as if the shore is over here, as this water comes up and is brought up in upwelling events that are sort of seasonal cycles that occur. So we have a pretty good idea of what these blooms are doing. We have continued to monitor. Now, we started in 2003. I told you around 2002 to 2003, we had one of these quote-unquote unusual mortality events. They tend to call them unusual no longer. We know pretty much what a lot of these things correspond to. But in 2003, again, this just shows you the height of these yellow columns indicate the amount of toxin present in the plankton. And I just went through and I clipped out the highest values we saw in our studies in these various years. And what you can see, I mentioned that here in 2003, this value was the highest value we had ever seen anywhere in the plankton. We then had a couple of low years. We had a very high year. In 2007, we about doubled that number. Then we had another year that was pretty toxic, a couple of low years. This year, we saw a value that doubled that value. So clearly, if you want to look at the trend here, given that we don't even know if this organism was producing toxin before 2002 or 2003, it looks like there is an escalation in the severity of these events. That is, they're becoming more and more toxic. And it looks like they're becoming a regular thing. Even though we don't always have a very hot year, we still have a number of years, as many years as not in the last 8 or so or 9 that have been hot years for domoic acid. If you eat an organism that has accumulated the toxin, it is not just shellfish that will accumulate the toxin. In fact, if you watch the reports, if you do any sort of recreational fishing or scuba diving, there are times when they will take Dungeness off the list. You can't collect them. The big issue that we have, the big issue that marine animals have in our region are filter feeding fish, planktivorous fish such as sardines and anchovies. They are planktivorous, and as they swim through the water and filter particles, these long strands of cells that the pseudonychia form, those are very easily filtered out. They get packed into their stomachs, and then an organism comes along, eats a number of those fish, and they get toxified. But yes, you need some way of concentrating that material and delivering it in a high enough concentration to cause a problem. Yes? That may be a typo. Actually, in the last decade in this region, but I think what that is referring to is globally in harmful algal blooms in general. So people have been following harmful algal blooms on a global scale now for a few decades. And you'll notice the first, one of the slides that I showed you that had the global picture had 1970 and then it had 2005 or something. So we're talking about a couple of decades where we have good information that we clearly see an increase in the number of documented cases or events. Again, I would caution that increased awareness also enters into that, and that's a tricky part. Then yeah, I'd have to look at that. That may well be a typo. Yeah. Yes. Yep. On the, sorry? Yes, this one. Oh. So yes, so you can put a lot of significance or very little, depending on what you want to believe. We have annual cycles, clearly, in our plankton. We have decadal cycles. We have almost one decadal cycle. Okay, we have global climate change, if you believe in it. Not everyone does, but global climate change. We have ocean acidification. That's happening, whether you want to believe it or not. We have a variety of factors that are changing on different timescales. And it is your choice if you want to say, well, oh my God, it's just increasing and it's going right through the roof. Or if you want to say, we're going through a cycle and we're going to come back down. We don't know yet. And there does seem to be this shorter cycle. And if I had anything that I could link to that, I would say rainfall. It might be one of the things that might be affecting it. But it's very difficult with and I hate to call this a short time frame because we've been looking at it for almost a decade, but it is a short time frame to try to make real decisions about whether or not we're seeing a true linear or some form of increase or whether we're seeing a cyclic activity. Yeah. I think actually I know there have been some that have been attributed to paralytic shellfish poisoning, the saxitoxins. But no, the interesting thing, because I have a colleague, we've worked together for years. She actually works on the Choptank River in the Chesapeake Bay. And so she knows of our research. She started isolating Pseudonychia species. This is the group that produces domoic acid from Chesapeake Bay. They've never, to their knowledge, they've never had a documented incident of domoic acid poisoning in Chesapeake Bay. She cultured Pseudonychia from Chesapeake Bay. She grew them in the laboratory, and they produced domoic acid. So we wonder, we conjecture, we speculate that there is something about the environmental conditions that are different in that East Coast location relative to what we see here on the West Coast that is allowing or inducing the organism to produce toxin there, but not here. Pseudonychia is a fickle organism. It doesn't always produce toxin, and it is typically, we believe it is induced in some way by environmental conditions to produce it when it does produce it. So we have little pieces of information, but we're still trying to tease those out. But I believe the animal kills on the East Coast have been largely, if not exclusively, paralytic shellfish poisoning, saxitoxins. Yep, and that would be, sorry, I take it back, because if you go into the Gulf Coast, it is actually it's neurotoxic shellfish poisoning there, typically. No, typically urchins are feeding on larger kelps and things, and they typically are not included. But again, I would recommend anybody who takes seafood out of the water themselves to go to the California Department of Public Health website and check as you do this on what's okay and where it's okay. Yeah, there was a question in the back. Yeah. It may, and in fact, I hesitate to admit that I have a colleague who has chased blue whales with a net, and blue whales, okay, point of trivia, everybody get your pen, blue whales apparently come to the surface to poop. So as they come and they do their thing, do their business, and swim away. She's been in there with a net collecting blue whale poop in order to analyze it for domoic acid and has gotten positive numbers. Now, whether or not there have been any deaths attributable to that, I can't tell you. There are some humpback whales in the East Coast where they do think it was saxitoxin that killed them. Yeah. Yes? Not to my knowledge, but lobsters are, I mean, they're, as you know, they're scavengers, and they will eat anything on the bottom. And yes, they would be suspect after a bloom. Often what happens with these diatom blooms, they bloom in surface waters, but then when they run out of nutrients, the bloom sort of stalls. They have all of this material up in the water column, and a lot of it will aggregate, sink to the bottom. And so there have been a number of documentations now, scientific documentations, where people have gone in and analyzed various types of benthic organisms, bottom-dwelling organisms, and they've shown that they can contain domoic acid. How much they contain and whether or not they reach toxic levels depends on where you are, what the bloom, the state of the bloom is, how hot the bloom is, and of course whether or not you eat the viscera, whether you eat the guts of that animal. Some people do eat more of an animal than others. Not too many people eat fish stomachs. If you had a large sardine and you wanted to be sure, or at least reduce your chances, you'd cut out the stomach. Right. There's another question. Yeah. It's patchy. Yeah, and the biggest problem that we have is trying to have presence in the ocean. It's really difficult, because these things are patchy, it's really difficult to know what's going on all the way up and down the coast. We literally have a network of scientists who work in various places who keep track of certain areas, and we communicate. And so I know, like I just told you, I know that there's a red tide going on now in San Diego. And I knew it before it hit the press because I had talked to the people down there, and they said, oh, we've got lingulodinium in the water. And I knew it was down in Baja before that because I have a colleague in Ensenada who sent up information. I know it's in Newport Beach because we made those measurements, and we sent it out. And now I know it's in Santa Monica Bay because we have a colleague at UCLA who samples off of Santa Monica Pier. So we do keep in touch with each other as much as we can, but we are a relatively small number of people. And one of the reasons that I do this is so that people are aware. And so I'll get calls in the middle of the night saying, Dave, I've got scum. So, those are... Right. Right. So we work with a lot of the mammal and bird rescue groups up and down the coast. Basically everything from San Diego up to about Malibu. We know all of the rescue groups, and we've analyzed samples. You'll see that information in a second. And so we know when they get rescues in, when they have strandings that occur. And we keep pretty good tabs, and in fact, we get fluids from them, and we analyze them for domoic acid. And it is patchy. So this past spring, we had animals that were coming in Orange County. So the Laguna Beach facility, Pacific Marine Mammal Care, that group got a bunch of animals in, like just in a week. They had like 10 animals, and a number of them were positive for domoic acid. Farther up the coast, farther down the coast, they weren't seeing it yet. So we do see this patchiness, and that is our biggest problem. If it were uniform, we could go out, take one sample, and we'd be in business. We'd know what's going on. But yes. And that is the other worry, that it does seem to be increasing its seasonality. I don't have that information, but we've seen blooms in the early 2000s as early as February, and now they seem to be shifting towards May and even into June sometimes. And anywhere in that range, we can see it. If you start seeing strandings, you should be calling the mammal rescue stranding groups. And they will be in touch with the group that's most appropriate. We're kind of at a break point here because we collaborate actively with a group at UC Santa Cruz, and they kind of cover Monterey down to Santa Barbara, and then we kind of pick up at Santa Barbara and cover south. But you could give us a call for sure or drop an email, and we'd figure out. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, some of them do. It depends. Some people have favorite people that they just like to give samples to, and some just give them out. So I'm fine going with questions if people are okay. If you want me to rush along, rush along. Okay. Maybe one last question. The cause of the bloom does vary depending on the algae, absolutely. So, think of species. The species idea is that every species has its own little ecological niche. And so, humans have a niche, bears have a niche, coyotes have a niche, and a unique set of environmental conditions that allow it to thrive or not. So yes, there are, for all of these organisms, even though we think of them as, they're just microorganisms and they're all the same, they're not at all. They're very unique. Oops. Very well, there's overlap in some great ways, but there are differences which we're still trying to tease apart in some cases. Yeah. It's complicated, I guess is the phrase. Okay, then I'll rush. Sorry about that. I will rush through this now. Then planktivorous fish is a big vector in our area. Sardines, anchovies, filter-feeding organisms, they get eaten by a variety of larger things, including human things, and that's where we can run into trouble. What we've been trying to do over the last several years, one of our big pushes is to try to make the link between what's going on in the water with respect to toxic algae and the production of toxins and their impact on marine animal populations. So what you're looking at, these figures are not as complicated as they look. This is pinnipeds, so marine mammals. This is our marine birds. The shaded areas here, these are the number of strandings that are taking place, going from beginning of 2006 into late 2007. And you can see where these strandings take place. Animals get stranded for a lot of reasons. They get into fishing gear, all kinds of things. They get boat hits. If you look at the green lines, that is phytoplankton that is producing domoic acid in the water at those particular times. And then if you look at the little red, clear stippled with the red line, those are animals that have stranded that we have tested, and they were positive for domoic acid. And what you're seeing, of course, is a general overlap. We see more strandings at time when there's domoic acid in the water, and at that time, they're seeing a lot of those animals coming in that are positive for domoic acid. You'd be amazed at how long and how hard we work to try and make that correlation so that people would stop referring to these things as unknown, unusual mortality events. There really is a cause for these things, and we do feel we have a good explanation for some of these. Okay, so we're there. Conclusions. We do have a few of these nasty organisms, these harmful algal blooms, or HABs as we call them, in coastal waters. They do seem to be increasing in frequency and severity, but remember there is this increased awareness. I like to put this in because I want to be an honest broker here. I'm not trying to tell you that every single thing is brand new and you've got to spend research dollars on this. There is an increased awareness, and that's a good thing. That's why I'm here, so people recognize what they're looking at and we can better study what's going on. There are some perennial hotspots. I showed you one, this area right near the breakwater of the LA Long Beach Harbor. We don't know exactly what it is. People want to say it's stuff coming out of the harbor. I'm not convinced it's actually that. It may simply be the physical barrier of the breakwater changes the water circulation. People have noted this in other parts of the world, that when you put a barrier in the water, all of a sudden you start getting harmful algal blooms occurring in close proximity to it. So it's a little difficult to tease out, but there's something about that spot, and it's the reason we're studying it. And then animal strandings tend to show a strong relationship to these toxic events, and the analysis of these animal samples are revealing high levels of contamination in some cases. The challenges are, the big one is why, when, and where are these toxins produced? What conditions lead to these toxic blooms? The big, million-dollar question or multi-million-dollar question now is, are these natural events and we're seeing a natural cycle? Are they anthropogenically influenced and we're just seeing them ramp up and they're going to continue to be so or to do so? We don't know yet. And of course, we want to know what the ecological roles are. We want to know if these things are toxifying their competitors. That's allelopathy. and thereby benefiting from the holding their competitors back. If they're stopping grazers from eating them, then that again is a great thing. If you're in the food web, you want to taste horrible. And we're trying to figure out what these nutrient or these ecological roles are for the toxins. And then finally, what are the temporal and spatial distributions, not just on our regional basis, but on a national basis as well. And then finally, can we mitigate these? Can we prevent these? Maybe. Understanding is the key. We're getting close on some of these issues to understanding at least the conditions that lead to them. Once we understand that, we can try to define whether or not we are influencing that. And if we are influencing these blooms, of course, we want to stop whatever it is that is stimulating or instigating them. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Let me get up to you with the microphone real quick. Go ahead. So we can capture.
Yeah, the islands offshore, are they susceptible, or is it primarily coastal that we're hearing?
We've seen toxic blooms go out that far, so they're susceptible in the sense that they're as susceptible as any other area coastally. Some of these Pseudonychia blooms farther up the coast, off of Washington, appear to form well offshore in oceanic waters, and then meteorological conditions are such that if that bloom spins in, that's when they get their big toxification along the coast. So yes, these things can be oceanic.
All right, let me get over to you with the microphone if you don't mind. Take a couple more.
I just wondered if any of the satellites that are doing the spectrographic data give any insights into that.
Yes, absolutely. The satellites are one of our primary tools, that and these autonomous vehicles that I mentioned. The satellites give you a very nice picture of what's going on right at the surface or close to the surface. Unfortunately, if you have a bloom that is going on in deeper waters, like down at 20 meters, which I showed you one of those figures, it can't see that. So we're trying to put together both information coming from instruments that fly through the water with remotely sensed satellite imagery, and we're trying to bring literally, that's one of our big research programs right now, is to link those two with measurements actually made by people in boats on the water. Okay, sorry we went over.
All right, well, if we can thank him one more time, thank you.